Imagine being a Nazi SS soldier in 1945, watching the tide of war turn against you. The Red Army is closing in. You've done unspeakable things to Soviet prisoners, to civilians, to entire villages. Now, as your world crumbles around you, there's only one thought racing through your mind. What happens if they capture me alive? The answer to that question is more terrifying than anything Hollywood could conjure up, because when the Red Army finally caught up with SS soldiers, they didn't just capture them, they unleashed a vengeance so brutal, so systematic, that even hardened Wehrmacht officers begged to surrender to the Americans instead. This isn't a story you'll find in most history textbooks. It's too raw, too uncomfortable, but it's a truth that shaped the final months of World War II and reveals the darkest depths of human retribution. Let me take you back to those final blood-soaked months of the war. The year is 1944, and the Red Army is steamrolling westward. After 3 years of the most brutal warfare in human history, after watching the Germans systematically murder 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, something had fundamentally changed in the hearts of Soviet soldiers. When I say changed, I mean something primal had awakened. These weren't just soldiers anymore, they were men possessed by a fury that had been building for years. Every burned village they passed, every mass grave they discovered, every report of German atrocities added fuel to an inferno of rage that would soon consume everything in its path. The numbers tell part of the story. Of the nearly 6 million Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans, around 3 million died in captivity. But numbers can't capture the sadistic cruelty that accompanied these deaths. Soviet prisoners were used for medical experiments, gassed in mobile units, starved deliberately, and shot for sport. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. The Red Army remembered every single atrocity. They documented them, shared them, and when the time came, they repaid them with interest. Picture this scene. It's January 1945, and Red Army units are advancing through East Prussia. They come across an abandoned German prisoner of war camp. Inside, they find the frozen corpses of Soviet soldiers, some bearing signs of torture so extreme I can't describe them in detail. The bodies show evidence of systematic starvation, medical experiments, and execution. Standing among those corpses, looking at what remains of their comrades, Soviet soldiers made a collective decision. There would be no Geneva Convention for SS troops. No mercy, no quarter given. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Word spread through Red Army units like wildfire. SS soldiers were to be treated as they had treated Soviet prisoners. But the reality was even worse than official policy suggested. Lieutenant Colonel Mikhail Volkov, a Red Army officer, wrote in his diary about encountering a group of captured SS soldiers in February 1945. His account, discovered decades later in Soviet archives, describes a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The SS soldiers, about 30 of them, had been stripped of their uniforms and forced to march barefoot through the snow. But that was just the beginning. What followed was a systematic campaign of psychological and physical torture that lasted for days. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had lost family members to SS atrocities, took turns inflicting punishment. Some captured SS soldiers were forced to dig mass graves, not for burial, but to stand in them while being shot at, with bullets deliberately missing to prolong the psychological torture. Others were subjected to the same medical experiments that Germans had performed on Soviet prisoners. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how methodical it all was. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated revenge. Soviet intelligence units had compiled lists of SS officers and their crimes. When these men were captured, they faced punishments specifically tailored to match their own atrocities. Heinrich Müller, an SS Oberfuhrer, captured near Berlin in April 1945, had been responsible for the execution of over 2,000 Soviet prisoners. His fate, recorded in classified Soviet documents, was to experience every method of execution he had used on his victims. The process took 3 days. The psychological warfare was equally brutal. SS soldiers who had bragged about their racial superiority were systematically humiliated. They were forced to perform degrading acts, to beg for food, to crawl on their hands and knees through the mud, while Soviet soldiers laughed and recorded their humiliation. Red Army Captain Ivan Petrov later recalled interrogating an SS officer who had run a prisoner of war camp where thousands of Soviets died. He kept asking why we were doing this to him, Petrov remembered. I showed him photographs of what he had done to our boys. He stopped asking questions after that. But the revenge wasn't limited to individual acts of brutality. The Soviet military implemented what they called reciprocal treatment protocols, official policies that mirrored German treatment of Soviet prisoners. SS soldiers were housed in the same type of overcrowded, unsanitary conditions that German camps had provided. They received the same starvation rations. They performed the same deadly forced labor. The mortality rate among captured SS soldiers was staggering. While regular Wehrmacht prisoners had roughly a 35% chance of surviving Soviet captivity, SS soldiers faced odds closer to 5%. Most didn't make it past the first winter in captivity. The stories that emerged from Soviet prison camps paint a picture of systematic dehumanization. SS soldiers were forced to wear uniforms marked with special symbols identifying them as war criminals. They received half the food rations of other prisoners. They were housed separately and subjected to what Soviet documents euphemistically called enhanced interrogation procedures. Former SS Untersturmfeuer Klaus Weber, one of the few to survive Soviet captivity, described his experience in a memoir published in the 1960s. He wrote about being forced to stand for hours in sub-zero temperatures, about being denied medical treatment for frostbite, about watching fellow SS soldiers die one by one from starvation and disease. Weber's account includes a particularly haunting detail. SS soldiers were forced to listen to recordings of testimony from Soviet prisoners who had survived German camps. Hour after hour, day after day, they heard first-hand accounts of the atrocities they had committed or enabled. Many, Weber claimed, went insane from the psychological pressure. The Red Army's revenge wasn't just about individual SS soldiers. It extended to their families and communities. Soviet forces specifically targeted areas where SS units had been recruited. Villages in Austria and Germany that had provided volunteers for SS divisions faced collective punishment. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this revenge was how it was justified. Soviet commanders didn't hide their actions. They celebrated them. Stalin himself reportedly said, "Let them taste their own medicine." Soviet propaganda praised the just retribution being delivered to fascist war criminals. The revenge took on almost ritualistic qualities. SS soldiers were sometimes forced to recreate the crimes they had committed, with roles reversed. Those who had overseen mass executions were forced to dig graves and stand before firing squads, only to be spared at the last moment and forced to repeat the process again and again. Red Army soldiers, many of whom were barely literate peasants, had been transformed into instruments of carefully calculated vengeance. They understood exactly what they were doing and why. Every act of brutality was a direct response to documented German atrocities. The psychological impact on the SS soldiers was devastating. Many committed suicide rather than face continued captivity. Those who survived often emerged as broken men, unable to speak about their experiences for decades. Some never spoke of them at all. Soviet records, declassified in the 1990s, revealed the systematic nature of this revenge. Special units were created specifically to handle SS prisoners. These units were staffed with soldiers who had personal experiences with German atrocities, men who had lost families, who had witnessed war crimes, who had been prisoners themselves. The training for these units was minimal, not because the Soviets didn't care about effectiveness, but because the motivation was already there. These soldiers didn't need to be taught to hate SS troops. They needed to be taught restraint to keep the prisoners alive long enough for proper interrogation. As the war entered its final weeks, the fate of captured SS soldiers became a powerful psychological weapon. Word spread through German lines about what awaited SS troops in Soviet hands. This knowledge led to mass suicides among SS units and contributed to the chaotic collapse of German resistance in the East. Some SS units fought to the death rather than surrender. Others attempted to break through Soviet lines to reach American or British forces. The few who succeeded in surrendering to Western allies were often terrified of being transferred to Soviet custody. The impact of this systematic revenge extended far beyond individual soldiers. It sent a clear message about the consequences of war crimes and contributed to the broader Soviet narrative of the Great Patriotic War, a story of suffering, resistance, and ultimate justice. But the story doesn't end with the war's conclusion. Many SS soldiers remained in Soviet custody for years after 1945, continuing to face the consequences of their wartime actions. Some weren't released until the mid-1950s. Broken men who returned to a Germany that had moved on while they remained frozen in a nightmare of retribution. The Red Army's treatment of captured SS soldiers represents one of the most systematic campaigns of military revenge in modern history. It was brutal, methodical, and utterly without mercy. But it was also, in the eyes of those who carried it out, entirely justified. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the human capacity for both cruelty and retribution. When does justice become vengeance? When does vengeance become a crime in itself? What do you think? Were the Soviet actions justified, given the unprecedented brutality of German treatment of Soviet prisoners? Or does this represent a moral failure that diminished the Red Army's victory? Have we, as a society, learned anything from these cycles of atrocity and revenge? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into one of World War II's darkest chapters compelling, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We're committed to bringing you the untold stories, the uncomfortable truths, and the human drama behind history's most significant events. Hit that notification bell, because next week we're exploring another story that historians have tried to bury: the fate of American POWs in Japanese camps and the revenge that followed. Trust me, You won't want to miss it. Remember, history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about understanding the depths of human nature, both the darkness and the light. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never forget the lessons that only truth can teach us. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.